All right, perfect. Hi, everyone. As you all are coming in, we will get started in just a moment. A note, this will be recorded and will be available on Facebook stream as well. We will get started in a moment. We're really happy you're here. Thank you so much. Emily, you can go ahead and share. All right, everyone, we're really happy you all are here. We're going to get started in a moment. Just wanted to welcome you all as you all are coming through. As mentioned, this is being recorded and will be streamed on Facebook as well. We are just troubleshooting as well at the same time, so we will get started in a moment. So please bear with us and welcome to our conversation about the federal budget. As you all settle in, words for everybody online, you are able to utilize the Q&A feature when you have a question. We will be answering some questions later in the program. You will have an opportunity to also see us on Facebook. So if you are watching from Facebook, you can submit questions there as well. We will get started in a moment. So welcome, everybody. Glad you're here. And we can go live right away. There we go. So it's going to be live on Facebook as we get started here. We do have the pleasure of having Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro on the line, but we want to make sure that you're able to hear her. So Congresswoman DeLauro, are you able to unmute? Just so we can, there we go. We can
There
see.
we are.
Perfect. We've tested it and it's great.
Okay.
All right. We are going to, well, you can see it. We are streaming live, y'all. So we're going to get started. Emily, you can stop sharing your screen and we can go ahead and get started. Everybody, we are so happy everybody is here. My name is Jenny Castillo, and I am the Deputy Director of the Southern Economic Advancement Project. Welcome to the Appropriations, Resolutions, and Shutdowns, what it all means for the federal budget. In partnership with ProsperUS, Center for Law and Social Policy, also known as CLASP, and the Congressional Progressive Caucus Center, CPCC, we are happy to be hosting today's webinar to decode appropriations buzzwords and explain the connection between federal, state, and local budgets. We'll discuss the federal budget's impact on essential programs our communities rely on and provide resources, ideas for advocates to engage in the process. We have a great array of speakers lined up for you today. This program is being recorded and streamed on Facebook and will be available after today. The chat feature will be disabled, but you will be able to ask questions in the Q&A section that is being monitored by our team at SEAP. Please note, SEAP, ProsperUS, and CPCC and CLASP are hosting today's conversation in a 501c3 space. We do not endorse any specific political party, specific legislation, or candidate running for office. All details shared are public, and this is an educational program only. We are honored to have Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro to be here with us today. Congresswoman DeLauro is a ranking member of the House Appropriations Committee, is from Connecticut's 3rd Congressional District, which stretches from the Long Island Sound in New Haven to Naugatuck Valley and Waterbury. Congresswoman DeLauro serves as ranking member of the House Appropriations Committee and sits on the Democratic Steering and Policy Committee. And she is the ranking member of Labor, Health, and Human Services, an Education Appropriations Subcommittee, where she oversees our nation's investments in education, health, and employment. Congresswoman DeLauro, we are so happy to have you here, and we thank you for your time. You can now unmute and share a couple of remarks with us today.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's wonderful to see all of you. And it's a little hard for me to believe we're sitting here on February 29th, and we are still negotiating the final 2024 bills instead of really being up and ready to go for 2025. But that is the state of play at the moment. And thank you, Jenny, for your introduction. My thanks goes to everyone at ProsperUS the Center for Law and Social Policy, the Southern Economic Advancement Project, and the Congressional Progressive Caucus Center for organizing the webinar and for really inviting me to come and spend some time with you. It really is an honor for me to join such a powerful coalition of advocates. And what you all are about, what you're advocating for is our nation's growth, our safety, and our security. And you believe, much like I do, that a government for the people and by the people must first and foremost serve and benefit the people. So I thank you for your important work, fighting for the programs that help American people feed their kids, keep a roof over their head, attain a quality education, keep their families safe, stay healthy, and everything that you can imagine in between. I know today you're going to hear step by step how government funding bills are crafted. First, let me just give you a brief update on where things stand as we work to keep the government open ahead of tomorrow's deadline. Just to give you a sense of what is at stake in talking about appropriations. Ordinarily, we would have begun our work on fiscal year 2025 bills by now. But as I think you know, these are not ordinary times in the House of Representatives. We have seen, with the majority party and their control of the House, we have seen attempts to use the process to underfund our government, which in my view is detrimental to the American people. Over and over again, the majority leadership, first under Speaker McCarthy and now under Speaker Johnson, they have catered to a minority of people within their own conference who are extremist in their views. And these are folks who never really vote for appropriations bills, quite honestly, and they don't plan to. But the emphasis is responding to their what their directions that they want to take in terms of cutting back in terms of programs that serve the American people. The bills that were introduced in 2024 really, if you took a look at all of them, in addition to the extraordinary program spending cuts, which affected all areas, whether it be education or health or transportation, all across the board, serious cuts, agriculture, that would, in essence, curtail the services provided by the federal government. And if I look overall at them and try to characterize them in some way, they look to eliminate public education. They would like to make abortion illegal nationally, ignore the environment and climate change, make sure that billionaires, corporations escape paying their taxes. So, but we are close to the 2024 finish line. We're going to get it done. We're going to keep the government open. And this is what we're trying to do in terms of the negotiations back and forth, is to make sure that we avoid, for instance, one of the cuts that has been proposed in education, to public education, is an 80% cut to the Title I program, which is the bulwark of our public education system in the United States. And now an 80% cut would mean over 220,000 teachers would have to go. I mean, in my state of Connecticut, 1,900 teachers would lose their jobs. So nationwide, over 220,000. And what we want to do is to make sure that that isn't the final analysis, that we are not going to be doing that. So I think out of this year's discussions and battles, if you will, what we will try to do is to make sure that they're not the deep cuts, and we will have some successes and victories as we move forward as well. And this is the fight that will guide us for 2025 as well. The process has been dragged out for a very long period of time. As I said, we're on a fourth continuing resolution. And the point of appropriations bills is that they must be bipartisan and bicameral. That means House and Senate Democrats have to vote for them in the House, and in the Senate, Republicans and Democrats have to vote for it. It's only under that circumstances that the bill goes to the president for a signature. And when that doesn't happen, you get a government shutdown. So we will look to, today, we will vote on a continuing resolution that says they'll give us 2 dates, a March 8th date, which we need to consider 6 of the appropriations bills, and then a March 22nd date, which we will finish up the rest of the remaining 6. There are 12 appropriations subcommittees. And so that is the goal at the moment. What we want to try to do is to get them done by that time, because if we don't finish the full year bills before April 30th, we will trigger a process called sequestration. That means that there will be indiscriminate across the board cuts to almost every single program that you care about. If we were to extend our current continuing resolution to May, domestic programs would face a staggering $40 billion in a cut, or a 5% cut. That really shortchanges the American people, in my view, as they continue to keep up with inflation and with the rising cost of living. Once we put the 2024 funding behind us, then the fight will be for 2025. And that then begins in earnest. The president will deliver his State of the Union address on March 7th. We anticipate that the president will present his budget on March 8th or March 9th going forward. So we need to keep a spotlight on the cuts that our Republican colleagues want to take us, because we're going to have some of these same battles over and over again. As I mentioned, I think they will continue to look at the Department of Education, kick teachers out of the classrooms. They're going to try to continue to eliminate our response to a climate crisis and weaken our global competitiveness. They're going to try to harm women by trying to ban abortion nationwide. And they're going to continue to harm families and hardworking people by destroying the lifelines that help to keep them afloat. The Fiscal Responsibility Act, which was signed by agreed to by the president and the then Speaker McCarthy, agreed to spending caps, which we know are really cuts, and those will still exist. So we're still very concerned at the threat of deep cuts, and that sequestration process I mentioned to you still exists, and that's what we tried to have to avoid. What we need to do is, the bottom line is, the only way to avoid disastrous cuts and harmful policy riders is to continue fighting as hard as all of you have all year long. I could not be more pleased to work with you, and thank you for the work that you have done. We need you to continue to engage, and you can never give up on these things, and you can never, take no for an answer. And you have a very unique voice representing the broad ideals of Americans from all walks of life. So we can secure appropriations bills that fully fund the programs that help American families. But at the moment, the only way we're going to do that is if we fight back against where not all, but some people want to take us in terms of limiting the federal government's role in the challenges that people face in their lives. And I will conclude with that. And, thank you so much for letting me be a part of your day.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman DeLauro. We really appreciate your time, your information, and everything that you've offered. Thank you so much for your work. And it looks like I got the memo to wear purple with you. So thank you so much. I know that you have to jump off, so you are able to jump off. But if we do receive any questions, we will make sure to share them with your office. Thank you so much for your time. We
Great. Thank you
appreciate
so
it.
much. Really
Have
appreciate you. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. We are so honored to have had Congresswoman DeLauro here with us today. It is now my pleasure to welcome Kat and Rricha to the stage. I'm going to introduce them first and then give them the opportunity to give you a great presentation. As mentioned at the top of the hour, we are taking questions in the Q&A section, so you are able to submit your questions there. We also will be answering some questions that came in through registration. Kat Rowland is the Legislative Affairs Director at the Congressional Progressive Caucus Center, also known as CPCC. Kat leads the Legislative Affairs team at CPCC and at CPCC Action Fund. She works to demystify the federal government and breaks down developments on Capitol Hill so every community can navigate the legislative process and fight for the solutions that they need to thrive. We also will have Rricha deCant speaking after, who is the Legislative Affairs Director at the Center for Law and Social Policy, also known as CLASP. Rricha is the Director of Legislative Affairs at CLASP, and in this role, she works with the Policy and Communications team to advocate for CLASP's policy goals on Capitol Hill. I'd like to welcome Kat to speak first, and you can go ahead and unmute and share your screen. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you so much for having me. As Jenny said, I'm Kat Rowland. I am joining you from the CPC Center, and I am going to kick us off today. So before we get into how the federal budget process works, I want to be on the same page as to why it matters. Why should we care about what Congress decides to spend money on and how it makes those decisions? Well, there are a couple of reasons. One, the federal government funds a lot of the services that we all depend on. And two, when it isn't able to decide how to spend federal money, the government shuts down, and many of those services that keep our communities up and running come to a halt. And you'll hear more on that later. Let me get into a couple examples of what the federal government funds, one of which we're going to stick with throughout today's conversation. Every year, Congress allocates money for affordable housing programs. Those programs cover everything from housing choice vouchers that help low-income families afford rent, to public housing operations and repairs, to legal assistance that prevent evictions, and a lot more. Folks might not realize that Congress is the one funding the housing supports that they depend on, because a lot of that money flows through cities, counties, and states, meaning that spending decisions that happen on the federal level have a direct impact on what your local government can do for you. To give an example, I live in Washington, D.C., as I think a lot of people on this call do, and D.C.'s Department of Housing and Community Development gets 95% of its funding from the federal government. So if the federal government doesn't provide this D.C. agency with the funding it needs, the buildings that D.C. is responsible for can fall into disrepair. And so that's how federal funding can directly affect Washingtonians' health and well-being. And the same goes for other places as well. But housing is just one example. Every year, Congress allocates funding for everything that falls under the discretionary portion of the federal budget. This just means programs that Congress has discretion over every year. It does not include programs like Social Security or Medicare, over which Congress doesn't have annual funding discretion. We call those programs mandatory spending, so Congress can't cut it off. Now, in fiscal year 2023, the federal discretionary budget amounted to $1.7 trillion, and that covers everything from the military to medical research to education programs, foreign assistance, and much, much more. Now, figuring out how to allocate all of that money to the various programs and services that the government runs is obviously a tremendous undertaking. So that's what we're going to get into today, how that happens. Now, we're going to walk through the federal budgeting process step by step. But before we do that, I want to call attention to the context in which we're having this conversation, which Congresswoman DeLauro did a little bit as well. As she mentioned, even though it's February of 2024, the government is still operating with funding levels that Congress set for fiscal year, or FY for short, 2023. You're going to hear more later about why something like that happens. But I raise it now because we're going to reference that FY 2023 process several times during this presentation and in our examples. We're doing this because we want to be able to take you through the process from start to finish. And as Congresswoman DeLauro shared, the FY 2024 budgeting process isn't yet finished. So in some cases, you're going to hear us talk about events that happened almost 2 years ago. So now that I've set the scene, let's talk about the opening act in the federal budgeting process, and that's the president's budget request. The president's budget outlines everything the administration wants to spend money on in the upcoming fiscal year. Usually the president will roll that out in February or March, about 7 to 8 months before the fiscal year actually begins on October 1st. Now, to understand what's in that budget and what we can learn from it, let's look at a specific example. The Housing Choice Voucher Program helps low-income families, elderly individuals, and people with disabilities afford rent in housing that they choose. You might know this program as Section 8 because that's what it's commonly called. The federal government gives funding from this program to local public housing agencies, and those agencies use that money to pay subsidies directly to landlords. This brings down families' rent burden. Housing choice vouchers are the biggest source of rental assistance in the country. So chances are, if you've heard of somebody receiving rental assistance, it might have been through this program. For fiscal year 2023, President Biden asked Congress to increase funding for housing choice vouchers by $4.8 billion, 17% more than it got in the previous year. That funding boost would help families who already depend on the program keep up with rising rents, but it would also let the government provide new vouchers to 200,000 households. So if Congress fulfills that request, it means many more families get help with rent. Now, I say if, because the president's budget does not automatically become law. Congress is free to adopt or ignore the president's suggested spending levels. So let's move on to Congress now. Once the president has sent over his budget request, Congress is supposed to put together its own budget resolution. And that sets the total amount of funding Congress can allocate to different government programs and agencies over the course of the fiscal year. Often this is called the top line number or simply the top line. Now, I said Congress is supposed to produce a budget resolution because in reality, that doesn't always happen. We're not going to get into the reasons why today. The important thing to know is that even if the House or Senate doesn't approve a formal budget resolution, they still have to agree on that top line number, the overall amount of money that they're going to spend, in order to decide how much money is going to go to specific priorities. So let's get into how those decisions get made. We're going to start with who is in charge of those decisions, and that's the House and Senate Appropriations Committees. These are the committees responsible for writing spending legislation, which is formally known as appropriations bills, hence the committee's name. Right now in the House, excuse me, that committee is chaired by Representative Kay Granger, a Republican from Texas. Because Republicans hold the House majority, there's a Republican chair, and Republicans make up the majority of members on that committee. The top Democrat on the committee, known as the ranking member, is Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro of Connecticut, who you just heard from. In the Senate, where Democrats have the majority, the Appropriations Committee chair is Senator Patty Murray of Washington State, and the top Republican, known in the Senate as the vice chair, is Senator Susan Collins of Maine. Now, within each Appropriations Committee, there are 12 subcommittees that are responsible for putting together 12 appropriations bills covering specific federal programs and agencies. You can see those 12 subcommittees and their corresponding bills on the slide displayed now. I will not read them all out because, as you can see, it is quite a mouthful. Now, you're often going to hear the Appropriations Committee described as powerful, and it's an appropriate description because members serving on appropriations hold the pen when it comes to doling out hundreds of billions of federal dollars. And as a result, advocates for federal programs and even other members of Congress and administration officials spend a lot of time and resources highlighting their spending priorities for members of the Appropriations Committee, or appropriators for short. Before committees start writing the year's spending bills, constituent advocates and lobbyists come to DC in droves to push for funding for specific programs and agencies. And at the same time, members of Congress are organizing themselves to write letters to their colleagues on the Appropriations Committee in support of their priorities. Now, let's take a closer look at what those requests to appropriators might look like. What exactly might you want to get out of an appropriations bill? First, I'll start with the simplest answer, which we've already highlighted, and that's funding. Appropriators decide how much funding federal agencies will get to implement specific federal programs. So to use our earlier example, let's say you support the Housing Choice Voucher Program and you want to see more people access it. In that case, you would ask appropriators to increase funding for that program so that it can get rental assistance to more families. By the same token, if you opposed a program, you might ask appropriators to reduce that program's funding or to not fund it at all. Second, appropriations bills can contain restrictions on federal funding. Maybe the most famous one is known as the Hyde Amendment, which for decades has barred specific healthcare programs from covering abortion care. Stakeholders routinely push appropriators to add new restrictions on funding or to repeal old ones. Third, in recent years, appropriations bills have included what is officially called community project funding, more commonly known as earmarks. Members of Congress request earmarks for state or local governments or nonprofits to complete specific projects in their district. In the past, earmarks have funded electric vehicle charging infrastructure, childcare vouchers, affordable housing repairs, and much, much more. Now, these requests, it's important to remember, like the president's budget requests, it's just that, it's a request. They do not automatically end up in appropriations bills and become law. The Appropriations Committees carry out a public process for debating and fine-tuning those 12 bills you saw earlier, and I'm going to transition to that part now. Now, this public process starts in those 12 subcommittees. First, there are going to be public hearings where administration officials make the case for the president's budget request and answer members' questions about agencies' specific funding needs. After that, the subcommittees make their draft appropriations bills public and hold a meeting where subcommittee members can amend and vote on whether or not to send that bill to the full committee for its approval. This meeting is called a markup because members make changes to the legislation that's in front of them. Literally, they mark up the text. Now, once a subcommittee approves its bill, the full Appropriations Committee can hold its own markup, and that lets additional members offer amendments and decide whether or not to approve the bill and send it to the full House or Senate to consider. Now, while both the House and the Senate Appropriations Committee follow the same process for developing bills, those bills don't typically mirror one another, even when the same party holds the majority in both chambers. Let me go back to our earlier example to explain how that works. In June 2022, the House Appropriations Subcommittee on Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development released its proposed bill for fiscal year 2023. That bill included $31 billion for housing choice vouchers. The same year, the Senate subcommittee proposed $1 billion less for the same program. And those choices have real implications for families getting rental assistance. So as I shared earlier, President Biden had asked Congress for enough funding to expand rental assistance to 200,000 new households. The House's proposed bill fell short of that goal, but provided enough money to expand access to 140,000 new households. But the Senate's proposal would have expanded rental assistance to just 5,000 new households, an increase, but one far smaller than the president's or the House's goals. So let's zoom in for a second on what that could mean for your community. Already, demand for housing choice vouchers far outpaces supply. Housing authorities can have tens of thousands of people on wait lists for years, and sometimes they can become so overwhelmed that they even stop adding new people to wait lists. I'm going to give an example. In Miami-Dade County in Florida, the waitlist just reopened for the first time in 3 years, and they only gave people a 2-week window to apply for a voucher. In DC, meanwhile, the waitlist is completely closed to new applicants, and there is no estimate for when it might reopen. So Congress's funding decisions here might mean the difference between families in your community finally getting rental assistance and moving out of a shelter and into permanent housing, or spending more time on a wait list. And that's assuming they can get on a wait list at all. So how do the House and Senate reconcile these differences and decide how much funding a program gets? You're going to hear more about that later, but right now I'm going to turn it over to Rricha deCant to continue walking us through this process. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kat. Let me just share my slides. Okay, hopefully everyone can see that. To pick up where Kat left off, I'm going to keep walking us through the process of how the appropriations bills move forward. So basically, after each appropriations subcommittee marks up their bills and passes it, they can go to the full House for a vote. These bills can kind of come up individually, or they can be grouped together in what is called a minibus, which are a group of bills that cover some of the subcommittee bills, but not all of them. If all the groups are grouped together into one package, it's called an omnibus. And this is relevant because when it's voted on in the House floor, then there is just one vote for that package instead of individual votes by members for each subcommittee appropriations bill. In addition, some amendments can be offered by the full House, so not just the members of the committee when it does come to the floor. Those amendments go through the House Rules Committee, and they are in charge of determining which can be made in order and called for a vote. In the last several Congresses, since the 111th Congress, amendments have been made subject to a structured special rule, and that usually provides an hour of general debate on the appropriations bill, and then amendments that have been approved can be debated, usually for about 10 minutes each. In order to be in order by the Rules Committee, the amendments usually have to be germane, which means that the amendment must be related to the text and not on a completely different issue. It must provide funds for activities previously authorized by law. It shouldn't impose statutory duties on a department or agency, and it should comply with the spending limits imposed by congressional budget process. Now, obviously, there are a lot of exceptions to these rules, but generally, those are the guidelines that are used to decide whether or not an amendment can be made in order. Hundreds of amendments can be offered and made in order, and sometimes those are also grouped together for votes in an en bloc, which means that there's one vote for a series of amendments to kind of move things along more quickly. So following our housing choice vouchers example, on July 20th, 2022, the House did pass the Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development Appropriations Bill as a minibus package. So in addition to that subcommittee's bill, they also passed agriculture, energy and water, financial services, and military construction and VA as all part of that package. But that's where the housing vouchers bill was when it passed in the House. The goal is usually to try to pass these appropriations bills in the House by June, July or so that the Senate has time to vote for them before the October 1st deadline of the fiscal year. And as we have alluded to many times, that doesn't always happen. So, you know, and not all the subcommittee bills may even have a House floor vote before the end of the fiscal year. So we'll go to my next slide. So after the House passes its appropriations bills, or during the same time, the Senate can also be considering its own appropriations bills, or it can wait for the House versions to come to the Senate and then consider those. In recent years, the Senate has been writing its own appropriations bills, and so they have their own markup and floor passage process. Their mechanism for amending the House bills is not the same as the House Rules Committee. Their bills come up the same as any other legislation, so it goes through the normal motion to proceed, debate, and then vote on the bill. Whichever mechanism the Senate does choose, the final bill must be through a House-passed vehicle. So as Kat had mentioned before, it is important that both the House and Senate appropriations bills mirror each other. And when the Senate is amending the House bills or passes a bill that is different from what was passed in the House, they either have to conference the bills so that they, you know, are in agreement on the final text. There's also a mechanism of trading text back and forth through amended versions, which is a less formal way. But generally, we've seen conference committees set up to try to reconcile the differences between the House and Senate bills. Usually the conference committee is made up of members of the appropriations committees. Sometimes leadership is also involved in these negotiations. So the goal is to conference any discrepancies by the October 1st deadline. Usually this is supposed to happen in September. This can be a long process, it can be a short process, but as we've seen recently, there have been elongated timelines where conferencing has not been able to meet that deadline. Just a quick note, there are some other appropriations considerations that come up during this process. So sometimes appropriations for a particular program or agency fall short for the fiscal year because of an unanticipated event or additional needs of the community. In these situations, the president can request supplemental funding from Congress. And if Congress still has not passed a budget for the following year, it can either get folded into the next funding package or it can pass a separate supplemental bill. If the need is urgent, Congress can act quickly on the supplemental. We saw this during the pandemic when COVID-19 was starting off. The president did make a supplemental request, and Congress acted pretty quickly and passed a number of supplemental appropriations bills to ensure that the economy was stable. Supplementals are usually exempt from rules that apply to typical appropriations, like spending caps. Sometimes also the appropriations bills may contain more substantive policies as well, and this is called adding a rider to an appropriations bill. It's essentially a policy that rides into law as part of the appropriations bill because it is something that is moving in Congress, so it's a way to get another policy bill into law. So members might seek to attach a rider to an appropriations bill that are considered must pass for that particular year. So an example I have of a rider is in FY22's omnibus bill. The Pregnant Fairness Workers Act was included, which requires employers to provide reasonable accommodations to workers who are pregnant in the workplace. And that was a bill that was bipartisan. It had been introduced many times in different Congresses, but This was sort of a last chance in the end of 2021 to try to get it passed for the next year, and it did move through that process through the omnibus bill that year. So moving right along, I think this has also been alluded to quite a bit, but one thing that has become, I would say, a norm in the appropriations process are continuing resolutions. So if all 12 appropriation bills have not passed, Congress may have to pass a continuing resolution for the remaining bills or for all of the appropriations bills. A continuing resolution pushes the funding deadline to a later date, but keeps the government funded at the current spending levels until an agreement can be made for the next fiscal year's budget. It can also make alterations to levels of funding and program authorizations. Congress has actually enacted continuing resolutions every year since 1977, except for 3 fiscal years. And it's happened 14 times between 1998 and 2023. Anomalies are also a piece that can be added to continuing resolutions, which can change the duration, amount, or purpose of a program. So essentially, anomalies can kind of amend the scope of the appropriated amount as it's added to a continuing resolution. I'll get into in a little bit about what that means for our current fiscal year 24 appropriation cycle, but just wanted to go back to our Housing Choice Voucher Program. So in 2022, Congress did have to pass a continuing resolution on September 29th and set a new deadline for December 16th. And that meant that even though FY23 had begun, housing vouchers remained funded at the same level as FY22. And as Kat spoke about before, this causes real hardships. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the cost of housing actually went up 4.9% between 2022 and 2023, which means that the funding level was not covering as many people as it was in the previous year because the housing prices had gone up. And states and localities might have had to scramble to find more money in their own budgets to make up the shortfall, or simply, be having to turn people away. The longer the government is flat funded, which means it's like existing at a level set for a previous fiscal year, the more difficult it can make it for people to access services that they rely on. So to follow this example, Congress did actually end up passing short-term resolution on December 15th, but just for a week. And then luckily, the negotiators were able to reach a compromise for all the appropriations bills on December 22nd, 2022. And so the final omnibus package, which included all 12 bills, was passed with $30.3 billion for the Housing Choice Voucher Program and signed into law by President Biden. So I think earlier on, I think that there was about a $1 billion discrepancy between the House and Senate bills. You can see the final number was 30.3, so they sort of met in the middle there. Congressional members sometimes oppose big omnibus bills to vote on because then they can't distinguish which policies and programs they're really supporting because it's either the whole package or nothing. So that's why you'll sometimes hear members complaining about having to vote for a large omnibus package that includes everything. So for the housing vouchers program, Congress did pass the appropriations bill that contained it, but it happened 3 months after the funding deadline. But what would have happened if they didn't? So then we would have had a government shutdown. So a government shutdown occurs when appropriations bills have expired and no other bill has been passed in both chambers that appropriate funding for the next fiscal year, or provides a stopgap measure through a continuing resolution. When there is a full government shutdown, it effectively means that all federal agencies, Congress, federal courts, and the executive branch cannot operate because there's no funding to keep their work going. Some personnel are deemed essential and may have to work without pay during a shutdown, and others are released from their duties and also not paid during the shutdown. There have been 21 shutdowns in our history, with 9 lasting more than a week. Since 2000, there have been 4 shutdowns, 1 during the Obama administration and 3 under the Trump administration. This trend shows that we are seeing them occur more frequently and that the appropriations process has become a negotiating battleground that can last for months past the original funding deadlines. So let us talk about what is actually happening currently that Congresswoman DeLauro talked about. So the deadline for fiscal year 2024 bills are actually coming up right now because of continuing resolutions that push the date to March 1st for 4 of the spending bills and March 8th for the rest of the 8. Last night, breaking news, that it was announced that negotiators had come up with a deal for a continuing resolution that would actually put 6 of the appropriations bills on a deadline for March 8th, and then for March 22nd would be the rest of the 6. And my slide is a little outdated. It also includes the Commerce, Justice, and Science Appropriations Bill and the Interior Appropriations Bill for the March 8th deadline. So that means that both the House and the Senate need to pass that continuing resolution to make sure the government stays funded after tomorrow. So the House is actually slated to have a vote today, this afternoon at around 1:30 or 2. And so, if it passes in the House, it'll go to the Senate and hopefully they can pass the deal quickly, and that'll keep the government open again. But you can see these situations come right down to the wire. We're less than, 48 hours away from the government deadline from the last continuing resolution, and things are still far from certain that everything will go smoothly, but it is trending in a way that the government will stay open. So I think, so I think we're a little bit outside of our normal budget cycle, or what is supposed to be a normal budget cycle right now. And because the next funding deadlines stretch all the way to March 22nd, it will probably be closer to April and May when FY 2025 budgets are, sort of actually reflected upon more deeply. Usually that process would start in like February. So as soon as FY 2024's bills are passed, or there's a continuing resolution for the full year, the 2025 process will begin. As Congresswoman DeLauro alluded to, the president will release his budget sometime in March, and that'll sort of be the starting point for appropriators and congressional leaders to start thinking about what is needed to fund FY 25 programs. Members and committees will often put their deadlines on their websites for when they want to hear from congressional members on their priorities. So that's really a moment where it's important that members are hearing from their constituents and different stakeholders on what is important to them, so they can start prioritizing what they want to include in their letters and in their asks to the Appropriations Committee. I'm going to just pause there because we do want to leave some time for questions and answers, and I know we've gone over time. So I'll just pause there, but look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you so much, Rricha and Kat, for your great insight. Yes, we are now in the time to ask questions. We've gotten some great questions coming through the Q&A, so I'm going to let those marinate for a little bit here. But I also wanted to give a big shout out to our team who is not on camera: Emily and Dee Dee from SEAP, Kendall from ProsperUS, and Jessica from CLASP. This strong committee has been dedicated to getting this program to you since last year, y'all. So a round of applause wherever you are. Let's give them a round of applause for all their help and all their support in making this happen. So a couple of questions here. I'm going to move from the questions that are coming in live, but also some of the questions that we've gotten in from the registration. So I want to ask the first one to Rricha. Can you break down how the allocation process works, and how do federal funds reach local communities?
Yeah, happy to. So there's different types of programs that are funded through the appropriations process. One typical thing can be project grant funding. And so there can be a competitive grant process where states and localities can apply for grants that meet the funding criteria that's laid out in the bill. Usually there's an agency in charge of administering the program, so they will set their own guidelines on how they will evaluate who's eligible, and also some sort of formula in how those resources will be distributed. It could be based on demographics or population of that particular area. And then there can be other ways that federal funding reaches local areas. Some can be direct payments. During the pandemic, people saw economic impact payments sent directly to them. There can also be federal matching programs where the federal government will match a certain rate on a specific program up to a certain amount. So there's different ways. There's lots of different ways that this can be structured. But it sort of depends on each program and how it's written into the law.
Thank you so much, Rricha. Okay, let me ask this question here. How does the fiscal year 2024 top line number compare to fiscal years 2023's number? Kat, are you able to share some insight on that?
Yeah, I can take that one. So we just found out last night, as Congresswoman DeLauro shared, that the top line number for defense spending and non-defense spending, those are the two categories that spending is typically broken into, are going to adhere to some previous agreements that leaders in Congress made. So the long and short of it is, on the defense side, spending is going to total $886 billion. That is a $26 billion bump compared to fiscal year 2023. On the non-defense side, spending is going to total $773 billion. That is a $4 billion cut compared to current spending.
Thank you so much, Kat. I have two bringing into one. Short-term resolution is the same as a CR, correct? And then a follow-up here, not sure if this was covered, but the CR is expected to be voted on by the House today under suspension of the rules. Can someone explain what that means?
Go ahead.
I'm out.
Kat, are you there? I've lost you, Kat. Can anybody else hear Kat? Can we try to now we can. Okay.
Okay. Sorry,
Go
but
ahead.
if I cut off Rricha, just go ahead and take over. So you might have heard that legislation lately in the House has been moving under what's called suspension of the rules. The primary thing that you need to know about that is these bills can only pass if 2/3 of the members of the House vote for them. They can only be debated for 40 minutes and no amendments can be considered. The reason the House is doing this is to bypass something called the rules process, which is a vote that takes place typically on a party line basis that decides what the parameters are going to be for debate. How long are they going to debate a bill? How many amendments are going to be made in order? Because the House has such a narrow majority, and that is typically a party line vote, even a couple of defectors can throw off that process. And a number of Republicans have not been willing to go with the leadership's plan as of late. This has forced everything to happen under suspension of the rules. Again, key things you need to know: 2/3 of the House need to vote for it to pass, not just a simple majority. No amendments allowed, and 40 minutes of debate.
Thank you so much, Kat. Rricha, a question for you. How do you decide whom to send appropriation requests to?
That's a really great question. I think, it's really important if you are, from a specific state or city that's trying to get funding to look at who represents your district and your state, you can usually find this information pretty easily on congress.gov. There's a little space on the right side of it where you can search for your member. And so for those types of projects, it's really good to reach out to the member that represents that district and make sure that they know why that money is needed. It can also be worthwhile to reach out to members who serve on committees that have jurisdiction over that issue. So going back to our housing vouchers example, the Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development Committee subcommittee on appropriations is the one that handles that. So they will be the ones who will be eventually marking up the appropriations bill. So it's good to kind of get on their radar and see what they are planning to include in their bill. And then there's also like different caucuses and things in the House and Senate that are dedicated to certain issues. So like one caucus is the caucus on homelessness, and they might want to advocate as a group for more housing vouchers. So it could be good to reach out to sort of special interest caucuses in Congress that can really champion some of these issues.
Thank you so much. We've gotten some really good questions. I'm trying to get through as many as we can in the time that we have left. What is the point of such short extensions? What do the House obstructionists gain?
I can cover this really quickly, and then Kat, please feel free to add on. I think, it is hard for members to come to an agreement on some of these issues. And in some situations, they really are working on the details and trying to make the best appropriations bill that they can get to. You see that with sort of like the 1 week extensions. The reason that they've put those 6 bills for the March 8th deadline is that they do feel that they are close to coming to a compromised version of those bills. There's also other dynamics because of the Fiscal Responsibility Act. There's also sort of some obstructionists want to just see a long-term 1% cut for the federal budget. And so delaying the final appropriations process from happening can make that be a reality too. So it kind of depends on whose perspective you're looking at and what their goals are. If they want to actually have more time to pass the bills, or if they think dragging the process might help them reduce funding in the long run.
Thank you so much, Rricha. Kat, do you want to add to any of that?
I think you covered it great.
Perfect. So my next question is for you, Kat. When should organizations start to get involved in the process of learning and educating around the FY25 budget?
That's a great question. I would start right now. I would expect the president is going to preview his budget next week during the State of the Union. That is typically the first foray into talking about the following year's spending priorities. He's going to release his formal budget request to Congress soon after. I believe the target is March 11th. As Rricha said earlier, Congress will probably get into the nitty-gritty work of writing these spending bills later in the spring, but now is the time to figure out some of the information that she suggested folks get on top of. Who represents you in the House? Who represents you in the Senate? Who are the champions for your priority that you might want to know about? This is the time to really prepare those advocacy efforts because
We lost you again, Kat. Ooh,
oh no, I'm so sorry.
it's okay. It was just like probably the last 5 words.
Okay.
Okay. Well, thank you, Kat. Thank you, Rricha. We are coming up on time, y'all. So try to be respectful of the fact that we weren't going to take too much of your time. I want to thank Rricha and Kat for your incredible insight. To Congresswoman DeLauro, thank you for your time, for everything that you shared. And most importantly, our viewers, thank you for your time, for your questions. You could have been anywhere. And since this is a webinar, you probably are. But we appreciate that you had a commitment to stay on the line with us ask some questions, and we hope to get some of these questions that weren't answered live answered in our follow-up. We also ask one more thing of you at the end of this program. You will get a survey, and we hope you participate. It is anonymous, and it asks about 3 to 4 questions so we can get your thoughts. It's immediately after we hang up with you all on here. This will be available. This recording will be available after today's call. We do have it on our Facebook, on SEAP's Facebook page, so you are welcome to see it there, and it will be also recorded to the cloud, so you can see the Facebook is added here, facebook.com/SEAP News, so you can see the recording, but we will also share it to those who have registered. Thank you so much for your time. We wish you a phenomenal rest of your day and a wonderful weekend. Thank y'all so much. Have a great one.